Hello, and welcome to the C plus B Community Talk in partnership with Heritage Months for our conversation on the evolution of autism and neurodiverse advocacy. You will see that we have a live transcript available at the bottom right of your screen. So be sure to use that if you need it. First, we're going to start off with the land acknowledgement. So before we begin, I want to take a moment in the spirit of healing and peace to acknowledge and honor the indigenous peoples of the land upon which the University of Denver stands, the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute tribes, to acknowledge that the land where the University of Denver now sits is the ancestral homeland of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, of whose loss we both recognize and mourn. Like the history of so many institutions in the American West, ours is a complex and sometimes painful. In recognition of this fact, and to underscore our commitment to inclusion and equity, we commit to listen to and affirm the stories of all in our community. We are so excited to have you all join us for another celebration. C plus B has had the opportunity for the past few months to partner with the Heritage Months initiative as we honor the diverse identities and histories of the DU community. Part of this work has included dialogue, and I'm honored to introduce our moderator today. Sarah Mooney is an academic counselor and social skills building programmer at the Learning Effectiveness Program at the University of Denver. In this role, she supports students' executive functioning and social development. In addition, Sarah leads the faculty and staff neurodiversity resource group on campus and acts as staff advisor to the student neurodiversity resource group. She has over 8 years of experience supporting the students with disabilities in both higher education and K through 12 settings. Sarah is guided by a strong commitment to educational access and equitable classroom practices.
Thank you. Welcome. I'm excited to be here today to celebrate Autism Acceptance Month, as well as discuss where we hope to grow, both as a university and society, in terms of neurodiversity and inclusivity. 1 in 59 children are diagnosed with autism, and 1 in 225 incoming first-year college students in the US are diagnosed with autism. However, fewer than 20% of autistic college students graduate or are on track to graduate within 5 years of entering college, and 85% of autistic college graduates experience unemployment. Autism advocates hope that as awareness and acceptance of autism increases within the larger population, the stigma of diagnosis and the social barriers that hinder people from living full and meaningful lives will dissipate. Today, to help us think and discuss this further, I'm excited to welcome today's panelists. We're joined by Christina Crow, who is the Executive Functioning Specialist at the Learning Effectiveness Program here at the University of Denver. Christina Crow is the resident executive functioning specialist at the Learning Effectiveness Program at DU, as well as the founder and CEO of Remind Brain Training. Christina specializes in executive functioning, brain development, learning differences, disabilities, types of neurodiversity, and the utilization of research-based strategies to intentionally target and effectively enhance individual neurological development. Christina provides executive functioning coaching and consulting services for students, families, educators, and professionals of all ages, assisting neurodiverse individuals in a better understanding of their own strengths, challenges, purposes, and potential while gaining the functional skills to achieve personal success. We're also joined today by Roger Smith. Roger is originally from Canada, and he joined the Air Force Academy Foundation in January 2021, where he serves as Vice President of Stewardship. Prior to the foundation, Smith served in the University of Denver Advancement Office as the Executive Director of Development for Special Initiatives. Roger has over 20 years of higher education experience and has lived and worked in 13 countries for a global nonprofit. Within higher education, he has served in various roles in athletics, development, alumni relations, international admission, international education, and EDI, or Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. In the role of principal designated school official, Smith also had a stint at Colorado College, where he helped international students navigate the world of non-resident alien compliance. Smith has eclectic passions and interests. He graduated from a musical theater high school and was in a world tour musical theater production. However, what he enjoyed the most was playing semi-professional football, Canadian. Smith has 3 kids, aged 15, 13, and 11. He and his partner, Allison, and Lovey the dog enjoy photography and taking advantage of trails and sweeping views of the Rockies. Smith earned a Bachelor of Science in Management from Carroll University and an MBA in Organizational Leadership from Keller School of Management. As a leader, Smith believes in ingenuity and vision brings team members together under a common goal and creates a vibrant, empowering workplace culture. Thank you both for being here today. I want to start off by getting to know you both better and the viewpoints that you're bringing into this conversation. So we can start with Roger. What brings you into this space today, and how do you connect with autism and neurodiversity?
Thanks for the question, and I would be remiss if I didn't say it was an absolute honor and privilege to be with all of you today. And Sarah, I love that question because historically, being on the spectrum and having what used to be coined as high-functioning Asperger's was something that I did my best to hide. I was really scared. I was ashamed of it, embarrassed. I didn't want anyone to know. And I feared that if an employer found out what I have, that I wouldn't be eligible for the same kinds of opportunities, promotions, etc., and that would stymie the career trajectory that I wanted to see myself on. However, what gave me the courage, I think, to come out of the proverbial neurological closet, I think, was coming to terms with the fact that your identity is your most valuable asset. Thus, for me, I reconciled the fact that the most important thing that I could do was to be myself and develop my own uniqueness. And then in this process, which wasn't an easy process, of course, I learned that the most courageous thing anyone can do is the act of being fully seen. And then that translates and percolates into other spheres and dimensions of my life, both personally, professionally, relationally, and so on. So as I went through this process of embracing that identity marker and part of who I am, it was over time coming to terms that dialogue and programs and venues just like this, that is what helps us bridge the divide and build these bridges of understandings across the chasms of the unknown.
Thank you so much for sharing. Christina, what brings you into the space today, and how do you connect with autism and neurodiversity?
Good morning. I guess I would say I have a history. At the beginning of my career, I was a special education teacher. And so that's where I had a lot of interaction and worked with a lot of individuals with different types of neurodiversity. So now with my work with executive functioning coaching at DU and through my own business, I specialize in executive functioning as well as like understanding the neurological differences that we have for all individuals on the spectrum, as well as other different types of what we have identified as disabilities. So it's a passion of mine. It's what my work is engaged in, but also personally, I think I also experience some different sensory and processing differences. And so I just really relate to the different concepts of neurodiversity and understanding the differences that we all have intellectually, emotionally, socially. So I think that's my biggest connection. And I'm just so excited that we're here, that there's places like this where we're sharing and having these discussions. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you guys for sharing your stories. I'm really excited to hear your perspectives today around autism acceptance. And to kind of build context for our conversation, in your opinion, what has been the historical trajectory of autism acceptance, and where do you feel we currently stand as a university or within our greater communities around this?
Christina, you go ahead.
Okay. I mean, I think it's been a crazy history with how we view different types of neurodiversity, like autism. I'm going to do a shout out for a book that I love that's called, I don't know if you can see it, but it's In a Different Key. It's the story of autism. And so this book really highlighted and pointed out the history of autism and where we've come and how our perspective of what this difference is has changed, how we've responded to it has changed. So I think in the very beginning, what this pointed out is that there's a connection between maybe what we considered like the wild boys of the forest. And that's that these individuals that had differences like autism might have been excommunicated from the communities and left to kind of fend for themselves, and we're not a part of the community. So I think when you think about that too, in the 70s, when we started to identify and better understand autism, it was then looked at as like something that was created because of the relationship between the mother and child. So mothers were then blamed for being cold towards their children. And so that's why we were seeing these different social differences. So now that we've understood that there's genetic and neurological, physiological differences that are associated with this, then people began to think, okay, so now we have to search for the cure for autism. And so that's why it was like, you know, a lot of the first awareness and everything that was being shared among the community was fixated upon that. But then individuals within the community themselves are speaking up and saying, you know, we don't want to be cured. And that's where I think maybe we are with understanding and accepting these neurological differences. But in my opinion, we still have so far to go. Like acceptance implies that we're accepting something that we don't like, right? That we're tolerating it or learning to be with it. And I think that it's more learning to appreciate and even celebrate these differences, because I think they're so important to us as individuals in our community, and creating different thinking and reasoning and potential as well. So I think we've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go.
Christina, amen. On multiple fronts. And absolutely, I think historically, when the vantage point was focused in terms of the spotlight on autism and the autism spectrum, it's typically been approached from a deficit perspective in literature, in social practice, in inner workings of living and work life. It was somewhat glorified with blockbuster Hollywood movies, which was a double-edged sword. On one end, to quote Jay-Z, you can't heal what's not revealed. And I've always wanted to quote Jay-Z, by the way, first time in my life, so I can check that off. That said, I think when you're looking at a lot of Hollywood films and celebrities, part of that double-edged sword is that it can accelerate myths because of how gloricized it is in blockbuster movies. And at that same time, it raises critical awareness at more critical mass levels, especially when you consider a lot of neurological variances, physical variances, and so on. In our society, a lot of those discussions are brought to the surface because there is then someone famous who has that particular challenge, whether it's Michael J. Fox, Parkinson's, Muhammad Ali, Bill Gates and autism, and so on and so forth. So you can go on down the line through history of now famous people with certain challenges that have typically been a stigma. And when I say challenges, not challenge in terms of what we inherit in the fact that that might not be perceived as a gift, but challenges in that we might reframe our paradigm to say what I have is actually a gift and an invaluable asset, but historically it has not been marked as a gift. And you had just heard a comment Christina said about in the past it was to how do we correct this? How do we fix this? How do we get rid of this? How do we streamline you so that you can fit into this tapestry and mosaic of society in an assimilative way? And further along that spectrum of tolerance, it's celebrating, and then beyond celebrating, it's realizing that if as a society we want to perpetually be on the leading edge of innovation, then the confluence of parlayed perspectives and ways of thinking that goes into that iterative ingenuity thought process is really key, because everyone, whether you're on the spectrum or not, is bringing that particular piece to the conversation. In terms of dialogue, I think dialogue has normalized a lot of elements. This is really critical. I think one of the markers of dialogue is that it normalizes leaning into the discomfort of ambiguity, which of course is wrought with uncertainty. But the more and more that we're being upfront that the purpose of our dialogue isn't to circumvent discomfort, because to have courageous conversations, you have to understand right from the get-go that that requires all of us to lean into this discomfort and sit with it. Not just sit with it, but how do we embrace it? And then how, as individuals on the spectrum, how do we be an observer of our own discomfort without over-identifying with it, as our discomfort is not who we are, but merely what we are experiencing from moment to moment.
Thank you for those insights. There's a few things that I kind of want to pull out and ask some further questions on that you guys mentioned. So Roger, you were just kind of talking about dialogue, and we know that language is an important part of dialogue. And language is also an important and powerful tool that we use to kind of express our identity and personhood. And we know that there's a lot of discussion around language and autism. Today, we've heard us use autistic, neurodivergent, person with autism, on the spectrum. What are some of the differences in these terms? What should we be using? And what does the community think about these different terms for autism?
I think, like most underrepresented populations, you're of course going to have some nuance that's influenced by culture, by ethnicity, by place of origin. In terms of the context on a social level, that's also going to vary. Living and working in about 13 different countries, these issues manifest very differently. So I think in the kind of context of the cultural paradigm of wherever one is living and working, really shifts what is germane and normative vernacular in that setting. For me, that said, I've always looked at myself as being an atypical person who is expending an enormous amount of energy to merge, if you will. If you think of that imagery of merging, what you're doing is that you're contextualizing the reality and then integrating your experience into whatever reality you're in. That could be social setting, work setting, relational setting, friendship setting, sports setting, hobby setting, and so on. And so everything is greatly departmentalized. And so you put an enormous amount of energy figuring out for yourself, how do I integrate the tapestry of my own experiences? And then in an integrated way that is authentic to me, that's going to look a little bit different. But for me to surmise that is realizing that we're not a monolithic group. Everyone identifies with it differently. I typically default to atypical, but I've never objected to any marker of how one would describe that.
Yeah, I think this is such a complex question that's constantly changing, right? As our perspective in society changes. And I think every individual has a different perspective and different preference of what they would like to be called. We've jokingly said that, like, to be politically correct and be okay with everyone, you'd have to say them all. You'd have to say an autistic, neurodiverse individual with autism, to cover all your bases. But for me, it's more about the context in which we use these different words. Like if you're referring to an individual with autism or someone who has autism or who is neurodiverse in a negative way, that's going to have negative consequences. And I think that it's a lot about how we're applying these words and why we're speaking of neurodiverse, autism, or a person with autism. And I think just like we do with gender differences, to be respectful of what each individual wants personally.
Thank you. I think that's really important, touching on identity and ensuring that we are validating people's personal experiences and personhood and using the language that they would like us to use for them. I agree. Another thing I heard you mention, Roger, while you were speaking prior was about some of the myths that have been perpetuated within our society through media around autism. And though, as we were talking about, we're moving from awareness to acceptance and celebration, we know that there are still many pervasive myths around autism. So what are some of these most prevalent myths or false beliefs that people hold? And how do we debunk those myths as a society?
That's a great question. I like that. And this comes up in a lot of conversations I have. And many times I've been told that I'm a robot in terms of whether there's a crisis or whether something is epic and the best day of my life, that my voice is the same, my tone is the same, my facial expressions are the same. That may be predominantly true most of the time. However, I think one of the myths is that we don't experience emotions. And I experience all of the emotions. And what I've learned for me is that anytime I try to blunt out something that is unpleasant, I also blunt out my ability to experience joy and happiness and contentedness, because it's not mutually exclusive. Emotions, whether we coin them as unpleasant or pleasant, are all together in an integrated fashion. And there's no bad emotion. Oftentimes we hear in books or in movies, etc., that feeling a particular way is negative. And so what happens is that as a society, we then don't enable and empower ourselves to feel what we feel, to feel sad, etc., to feel depressed, to feel anxious. I also have generalized anxiety disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder. And when all three things are hitting me really hard with autism, OCD, and anxiety, it becomes extraordinarily challenging. But I am experiencing all of those emotions. I just experience and express them in an atypical way. So the way that my amygdala interacts with my prefrontal cortex is biologically different. My brain doesn't commute emotional information in the same way. It will dissipate from that situation when there's a particular heightened level of emotion, not because I'm doing that on purpose, not because I'm a robot, but that was how my maker designed me. And with that also comes inherent gifts as well. So just having the dialogue, and I'm always welcome to folks asking me questions, especially my kids. My kids love to ask me questions. And the more that we socially normalize it, the more that we understand that we have much more in common than our differences. And it's certainly not a deficit. It doesn't make anybody better or worse than anyone else, simply different. But if you look at all those differences, that's what makes that mosaic picture beautiful. So it's this constant reframing what it is that we're talking about.
I love that, Roger. Thank you. I don't know how else I could follow. I think there's a lot of myths that are pervasive with autism. I think that generalizations are typically the ones that get most overblown, such as I think girls get undiagnosed because the way that they're behaving or their type of neurological diversity, I think, is a lot different than the boys. So I think a lot of people see autism as being in this exact box, kind of like what Roger was saying, that there's kind of this like no affect, robotic like thinking and reasoning, very concrete, and not wanting social interaction. So just this idea that that's how everyone on the spectrum is, or that it fits within that box. And I think that what we're realizing is that it's much more than that, right? That the spectrum of neurodiversity for autism and for a lot of different kinds of neurological differences, they're very wide and almost very specific to each individual. So I think just those overgeneralizations, as well as girls not, their traits and their differences not being identified as much, and the expectations that those lead to. So thinking that because of the different social interaction or affect that individuals might have, that means they don't want to communicate, or they don't want in-depth relationships or connections. And so I think there's this divide between what is and what people want and what we are thinking that they want.
Thank you. From your perspectives, what are some of the emergent problems that are currently impacting the autism community?
I think there's a couple divides within the community itself. I think that originally there's a lot of individuals that weren't on the spectrum themselves speaking up on behalf of the autistic community. And then on the other side, you have the individual saying, I don't like the message that they're sending, and this is what I want for myself. So I think even for those who are in the conversation or supporting it, there's a lot of divide within the community itself. So I think that's really a big issue, as well as access issues. I think access to colleges as well as to jobs is individuals are underrepresented and their skill sets aren't so. And I think it has a lot to do with the interviewing process and how we're screening individuals out and accepting them into our communities. So I think those are some of the big issues that I've noticed.
Christina, I love those comments. That's wonderful. And to piggyback off that same dramatic theme, I think what comes up a lot for me as a challenge is just what Christina said. We're certainly not a monolithic group, just like any other aspect of society. Even within ideological groups, you still have a lot of variance. And it's an understanding more within the diversity, within neurodiversity, is to understand more about that, the way that we interact or some of our habitual patterning, although it may have an unpleasant impact of others, it's not a genesis from a place of ill intent or desire, though that is the outcome. So I always hold myself accountable to a negative impact because it doesn't matter what my intent is. And that's where I've had a lot of work with an autism specialist to be aware of how particular social cues, emotional cues, if I'm not aware of what is typical and not atypical, which is my default, then I may inadvertently hurt people unintentionally. And oftentimes, regardless of what my intent is, I think it's important for folks to give us an opportunity to keep improving on how we're interacting with you. It can be an infuriating process, especially intimate relationships, because it could come off as, well, we just don't care. We wrote it off and we're perfectly capable of acting a different way. And it's that perception of that lack of care which causes a lot of pain for others. And I think it's important to understand that for most people on the spectrum, and I'll speak to myself, I lack theory of mind. So when someone says to me, how would you feel if this happened to you? That's not a great question to ask me, because more often than not, I wouldn't feel anything, nor would I have any element of cognition or thought. So if I'm asked that question and I'm giving an honest answer, it would be, I would feel nothing and nothing would happen to me, and it would be not a thought, not because I don't care, but although you may be able to have rapport with me and connect and land with me in a conversation, there's all these invisible other layers with how my brain is functioning, my cortex, how my amygdala, which is structured a little bit differently, the fact that my brain doesn't prune, the fact that I have more mini columns through the layers of my brain that causes me, when I'm talking to someone, to have a million things happening all at once. So I might be giving you eye contact, we may be landing and building rapport, but at the same time, my mind is constantly calculating things, and I could be listening to you and I could repeat back everything you say to me, but I might be writing a blog while I'm talking to you. I might be reciting certain characters in a movie, and I try to keep that all at bay, but it's not always possible for me to do that. So it's just understanding that there's a whole other parallel world that is concurrently happening. So sometimes if I seem aloof, or that I'm not being attentive, or that I'm not seeming to care about something that maybe you're telling me that's really sad and I'm reacting the same to it, it's being patient, because there's habitual practices that take a lot of time to unlearn. And for everybody, that's different. So for me, I intellectualize everything. Something bad happens, a tragedy, I intellectualize it first, and then think about my emotional response second. And it's in a methodical, linear order. So I know I just said a lot, but I hope that gives you some insight and context, because with my lack of theory of mind and how I naturally intellectualize everything, I'm not always going to match my empathy to the emotional weight and gravity of said situation.
Thank you for sharing your story and so eloquently kind of putting your perspective out for us. I really appreciate that. Christina, one of the things that you mentioned was around employment. And how it can often be difficult for autistic people or people on the spectrum or atypical people to find employment based on some interview practices or social expectations for employees. So what are things that we can do as employers to create more equitable workplaces for autistic people?
Yeah, that's such an important question. I think first it starts with the screening process, right? Like when we're interviewing, what happens so often is that we're judging off of eye contact and this exact boxed response that we're looking for, a very typical something that says that you fit in that box and you checked it. And so I think that expanding the hiring process to include like problem solving models, or like, exact things that allow you to practice the skills that you'll be using in the position would be much more helpful for even the people interviewing, right? Because then you match those skills better. I think it's thinking about universal designs or practices for all neurodiverse individuals, right? Not just for individuals on the autistic spectrum, but for all individuals, and how we can be supported in the workplace in different areas. So there's really easy practices as far as like thinking about environment and lighting and breaks, and how you're allowing your individuals to work remotely or in an office. There are a lot of different accommodations that we can provide across the board, or even buddy systems, right? Teaching social norms to new oncoming employees. So it's practices that have universal design at heart, but also the individual providing some of that individual support and not screening out individuals based on social norms. I think that those are things that would help very much in the workplace. And like Roger was saying before, it's really only to those companies' benefits. What we're realizing is the companies that have opened up and changed their hiring practices and some of the support are some of the most successful companies, because you see that ability for new thinking and reasoning, the ability to adapt and create different problem solving abilities. So it's a win-win on both sides for sure.
That's a huge point. And I think from my experience, sometimes what's not fully understood, and I especially noticed this in undergrad and graduate school, generally, of course, there's standard operating procedures, which we all need to abide by and follow. But typically, folks who think in a similar fashion to the way that I think and process information, I think there's nothing more soul killing than this notion of a prescribed way of doing A, B, C, D, E. So from my vantage point, as long as we get to X in an agreed upon allotment of time, if it's too prescribed as far as how do we get there, that's what I find extraordinarily excruciating and challenging. However, I'll be the first to tell you that the way that I approach things is more than likely, and maybe to go out on a limb and say, maybe in ways that most people have never seen before. And so it's sort of this journey of, all right, I said ABC. I'm not really sure how in the world, by looking at what he's doing, he's going to arrive at E, if that is the goal. But I think you have to trust that folks who are atypical, in order for us to arrive at E, we have to be able to translate what you've said into the way that we understand it. Check in, we're parallel here. We're moving along the same trajectory. However, the process that I have for doing that, if it's too prescribed, it really is soul killing, to say the least.
Thank you. And kind of looking more institutionally at DU or systematically within higher education, what are some steps that we should be taking to increase accessibility and equity for neurodivergent people?
I think my answer really just replicates what I was saying about in the professional industry, because I think it's also based on universal design. What Roger really pointed out to me in his last response is thinking about that flexibility, right? That there's flexibility in different modes to take in information, as well as flexibility on how you're showing your knowledge or what you've taken in, right? And what you're producing, what are you putting out? So thinking about different ways to present information, whether it's using different modalities so that you're in class or that you're able to watch videos or see a transcript of it or see an example of it or have an experience of it. There's multiple ways you're taking in information, as well as multiple ways to take it out, that you're not only expecting like a written response in a certain way, that maybe there's different ways that you could give it, like a video or presentation. Or so I think creating that flexibility within universal design will give a lot more access to different students, as well as thinking about the screening processes that we're using to allow our students into college. I don't know if this is just for, not just for individuals on the spectrum, but the standardized testing that we're doing is not serving that access. It's definitely hindering access to a lot of individuals that would be successful.
Thank you. I think we're going to go and look at some questions from the Q&A. So we have a question: as a parent of a first-year DU student on the spectrum, what do you recommend we might do to encourage him to make the most of his time at DU? Right now with COVID, he has stayed living at home and he has not made friends he's spent much of his time online.
I can certainly relate to some of the concerns you might have, and to put some perspective and context around my thoughts on this. In high school, I typically ate in the stairwell by myself where there was no one, not because I didn't enjoy interacting with people, but I found it at times unbelievably draining. And then when I feel I could go out and interact with people, then I would do it. And I did this all in secret. I would find stairwells, I would find nooks and crannies where no one could find me. And so for folks who know me, that might be a total surprise. Did the same thing in college as well. And in fact, even to this day, oftentimes I will avoid socially eating with people at lunch like the plague, because I just need that time in my own space, my own thoughts, Not that I don't want to build community. I think that's really important, but I will often just thoroughly enjoy doing things by myself. I will hike for 8 hours by myself. And the thought at times of doing that with other people seems excruciating. I'd rather be by myself. I go to movies by myself periodically, obviously not right now. And to me, that's it's going on a date with yourself is sometimes the greatest thing on the planet. I enjoy that. My parents, I think what was extraordinarily helpful was just the radical acceptance of whoever you are, your identity is your most valuable asset. Never try to be like anybody else. So that reinforcement. Now, the double side of it, I would be lying if I told you I didn't go through moments of feeling that utter abject loneliness, because when you're an atypical person and you're hyperly aware of constant adjustments to merge in, so to speak, to all of these different situations, it's helpful to know that there's other people like you that are out there, and that over time you can be assured that you're not always going to feel lonely. You're not always going to have a hard time building rapport. At one point in my life, I just thought, maybe I'm never designed to fall in love with anyone. Maybe I'm never designed, and it's not my destination to ever have a long-term intimate relationship with anyone. And that to me was really depressing. And I went through horrible bouts of loneliness and depression because from the outside, it was perceived that, oh, he's happy, nothing's ever wrong, always experiencing these things. In fact, at the height of that, I think it was the opposite. So the fact that you're asking these questions, having dialogue with your son, affirming their identity, that is the most valuable thing, is to realize you don't have to go in and solve anything, but if you can tether with your son or daughter, friend, partner, anyone who that is, and just say, I don't understand, I might never understand, but what I do understand is that I want to be in this with you, and I'm here if you ever want to discuss something or talk about it. Now, be prepared that that discussion may never come up. It was extraordinarily rare for me to talk to anybody about anything. My best friends had no clue what I was experiencing, because someone like me on that spectrum is not going to articulate nor know how, because I didn't have the tools to articulate what I was experiencing.
Thank you, Roger. That's incredible. Incredible. You're just so vulnerable and you share so much. So thank you for sharing your experience. And it brought up a lot for me too, because I thought about my own college experience. And to be honest, there wasn't like that social side for me. I did get the most out of my experience, and I spent a lot of times with professors and in the libraries. And I was just like happy to be there in this place of learning and knowledge. That being said, I really related to what Roger said about feeling atypical and feeling like an outsider, right? And everyone, I think, wanting to be connected in some ways. I've noticed with a lot of individuals that had social differences or social anxiety, us moving online has greatly reduced that and helped, so that like when they're in class, they could focus on the lectures and what's going on, the information, rather than worrying about other people or what's going on around them. So I'll just put that out there, that I think that some of these adaptations are positive in a way for individuals that have certain types of neurodiversity. But I think we all need connection. So I would just say, like, finding individuals that share similar interests. Like, there are tons of clubs at DU, right? From D&D club to like, different intramural sports. I think that's how you say it, like non-professional, but I just play it because I think it's a good time. So there's tons of clubs to get involved in. For individuals with different diversities, they can also join the LEP. So what I think is so important to that, so Sarah is actually our social skills coordinator. So she does so many amazing events to get students involved and connected to our community and to one another. So that's a great just connection. But you also have an academic counselor and they can meet with me. So that's someone that you have every week that you're having a connection with. And that helps students, I think, open up and maybe identify some of these things that like, oh, this is hard for me, or this is a struggle, and can help them build some of those connections. So I think that's vitally important, right? Having people that you can connect with in different ways. So those are some supports that are offered.
Thank you for sharing. And again, Roger, thank you for sharing your personal experience as well. We really appreciate that. Another question we received is that in the workplace, do you have any tips for how to discern how much and what to share with your coworkers? And in navigating both wanting to invite them to engage thoughtfully in things like project collaboration without taking on the burden of educating the whole office on neurodiversity?
That's a wonderful question. From my own experience, it's something I had to learn through risk, failure, and reward in an iterative process, and then to celebrate all of those mistakes, because I have to be observant and I watch how people interact with each other, and then I memorize that, and then I repeat that behavior appropriately. And that said, I think something that's very common for folks like me, again, everyone is different, it's not a monolithic, is there's a tendency to overshare or undershare because it's not understanding like what is normal in this situation. And just to give you simple things, in the past I've been invited to, whether it's someone's place for dinner or whatever that is, and then it'd be like, oh my gosh, like I have no idea, what do I bring? Do I bring this? Do I bring that? Is this normal? What are the protocols, etc.? What's the protocols for gifting? And then over time, you just keep observing and learning, and so you arrive there. Now, dating is a whole other planet. Before any date, I would maybe sleep 2 hours the night before, and would be so anxious because I'd be like, well, I don't even know how to talk to someone on a date. Like maybe I could script it all out and then just read it, or we could just text. That would work. Have a great dinner, glass of wine, and just text. So it was this whole other world of, oh my gosh, how do I even handle that? So I would just avoid any and all of those situations as much as possible. So in the workplace, what I would learn is the balance of wait till you build that rapport with someone and that match the level of vulnerability that you receive as a starter, because then when you're mirroring and matching, then it's within the confines of balance. And then over time, as you discern and pick up those observational cues, then you can build up your comfort with this reciprocal relationship that trust breeds vulnerability, and that vulnerability breeds trust. And then at the end of the day, you have to be willing to embrace being uncomfortable and try to normalize that. And there's a fundamental difference. Oftentimes we're taught that we should mitigate discomfort, uncertainty, ambiguity. But if we don't center ourselves on this risk, failure, reward continuum, we will never grow. And in order for you to grow, you have to be willing to be yourself, be fully seen, and that's okay. But to perpetually be an observer of yourself, and to day in and day out, hour by hour, realize that you're the only person that can put in that work to do it, and don't have skewed expectations that you're going to habitually change what is deeply ingrained and entrenched just by reading a couple books, going to a couple therapy sessions with an autism specialist. I guarantee you, you're going to go through this cycle: risk, failure, reward. Keep leaning into it, because you'll just keep growing and growing. And as you do that, your confidence will keep expanding. And then you'll, now I'm at a vantage point where I'll say, to me, the marker of maturity is emotional success amidst ambiguity and the successes of teammates around you. And it's an ongoing process.
I think that's a great answer to the question. It's what you made me think of, Roger, is that vulnerability that gets brought up. And I think I'm kind of about two minds about this, because in one way, sometimes when I overshare or share too much, it gives me this dirty feeling because it does make you vulnerable, right? It puts you out there. And I think you really have to be in a place where you're willing to do that. Something that it brings up to me is my sister's a hiring manager. And so she had described to me, she had someone who worked for her that had ADHD, and she didn't know at first. So before they disclosed and explained like how they were different, and this is just like, you know, kind of part of their characteristics or something that they go through once in a while, or their different attention and processing, she thought that they might have been doing drugs. So I just wanted to put that outside perspective. But then if you share your neurological difference with someone just by title, they might have a preconceived notion about what that means and what that is and what you're capable of. So I think from being about those different minds, what I think is maybe most helpful is if people disclose based on comfortability, like what Roger was saying, but also just based on accommodation. Thinking about in the workplace, what kind of differences or support, how are you going to need to work in your own way to be successful at accomplishing what you need to? And I would just ask for the accommodations. Anyone shares their differences like this is the way I work, this is my brain differences, this is what I need to be successful, and you ask for those things. So I would disclose just based on what you need from your employer.
Thank you. I just want to leave us with one last question, and it's more of a call to action, I suppose, but what is something that our viewers can take away today, or something measurable that they can do to have an immediate impact on removing some of the stigma that you've been discussing today around neurodiversity and autism?
The one thing that I would share that I'm really passionate about is if we can reframe thinking about neurodiversity and stop thinking about like an us and them thing, right? That they're neurodiverse and then the neurotypicals. Thinking about neurodiversity in general as being a spectrum and these differences and this atypicality, that we all belong on that spectrum, right? That I think it's kind of like bringing all those individuals back into the community and accepting their unique differences for natural variation in the human species, and that it's a very positive thing, and that it only helps us grow as a society and as individuals. So I think just reframing these differences in that context, thinking about it as we're all somewhere along the spectrum of neurodiversity, and there's no us and them group.
Thanks for sharing that. I'll take this non-traditional route to surmise, I'm going to say a tagline from the least place you would expect it. I used to work at Arby's in grade 10 and 11, and their slogan, "Different is good," I think surmises our dialogue succinctly and perfectly. Different is good. It's okay to be different. Develop your own uniqueness. It's your most invaluable asset. There might not be folks who really understand it, and that's okay. I think the most critical thing is that you understand it, and oftentimes we're not willing to open up our own hoods and take a look. And I know from my own personal experience, that longest journey for me was my journey inward, and the deeper and longer I was willing to sit in that discomfort of my own inner journey, then that shed a lot of shallowness and then started to build that foundation for emotional security. So I think the more that you know yourself, the more secure of a person you can be, And then in that, knowing more of yourself, then you can begin to really examine what your emotional maturity is. And I think, and I say this in the workplace, and when I'm interviewing folks, I like to try to assess this through behavioral questions in one fashion or another. But I will say to my team here is that one thing that I really look for is a marker of emotional security being security amidst the success of others without diminishing your worth to the organization.
Thank you so much, both Christina and Roger, for sharing today. That was so impactful, and I so appreciate you sharing your stories and perspectives.
I'm just going to echo Sarah and also thank you, Sarah. Yeah. Thank you, Roger and Christina. This was amazing and probably one of my favorite community talks thus far. Super insightful and vulnerable. So I did put resources in the chat for everyone, and we will be having more Heritage Month celebrations. So please stay up to date with that, and have a great Thursday, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.